You are entering a chapter where life begins returning what you thought was gone forever. But it will not return in the same form. It will return upgraded, expanded, protected, more aligned with who you are becoming. Almost as if the universe looked at everything that was taken, delayed, destroyed, or denied, and decided that simply giving it back would not be enough. Because what is coming is not meant to replace what you lost. It is meant to exceed it. The love will feel safer. The opportunities will feel more aligned. The home will feel more peaceful. The support will feel more genuine. The success will no longer require you to abandon yourself just to maintain it. Everything is going to feel different because you are different. You are no longer the version of yourself who begged life to restore the past exactly as it was. You can finally see that some of what disappeared could never have carried the person you were becoming. Some doors were too small. Some connections were too conditional. Some opportunities required too much self-sacrifice. Some environments only worked when you stayed silent, exhausted, grateful for crumbs, or disconnected from your own truth. So when life began removing those things, it did not feel like preparation. It felt like punishment. It felt as though everything you had built was being dismantled without your permission. But this next chapter is going to show you why the return could not happen through the same structures that failed you before. What is coming needs more space, more truth, more freedom, and a version of you who no longer confuses survival with belonging. The return will be greater than the loss. There are certain losses that change the entire shape of your life. They do not simply hurt for a few days and disappear. They leave an absence. They divide your story into who you were before and who you had to become afterward. And for a long time, you may have believed that nothing could ever compensate for what happened. How could life repay the years? How could it restore the energy? How could it return the opportunities you never received because you were too busy surviving what someone else caused? How could anything make sense of a chapter that felt so unnecessarily cruel? But divine restoration does not always repay you by recreating the past. Sometimes it restores you by creating a future so different that the past no longer holds the same authority over your story. You may not receive the exact opportunity that disappeared. You may receive one that recognizes gifts the old opportunity would have exploited. You may not return to the same home. You may enter a space where your nervous system can finally stop preparing for disruption. You may not rebuild the same relationship. You may experience a connection where you are not punished for having needs, standards, boundaries, or a voice. The higher form is not simply bigger. It is cleaner. It is safer. It is more sustainable. It does not arrive carrying the same hidden cost. That is why certain things could not return immediately. You had to become capable of recognizing the difference between something familiar and something truly aligned. Because when you have lived through enough deprivation, almost anything can look like a blessing. When you have been unsupported, the smallest amount of help can look like devotion. When you have been rejected, access can look like acceptance. When you have been surviving, temporary relief can look like permanent rescue. But your discernment is sharper now. Your standards are different. And the life that is approaching you must meet the version of you who finally knows that receiving something is not enough. It must also be worthy of staying. The comeback looks chaotic before it looks miraculous. Real comebacks do not always begin with visible evidence. Sometimes they begin with confusion, restlessness, detachment, the sudden realization that you cannot keep living according to the same patterns. You may feel as though you are standing between two realities. The old one no longer fits, but the new one has not fully revealed itself. You can sense that something is changing, yet you cannot point to enough physical proof to explain it. This is the part of the comeback that people rarely talk about. Before the blessing becomes visible, your inner world begins making room for it. Your desires change, your tolerance changes, your relationships change. The things you once chased stop feeling important. The environments you once endured begin feeling unbearable. You become unable to pretend that what is draining you is still acceptable. And that can make your life appear even more unstable before it becomes peaceful. But the instability is not always evidence that you are moving backward. Sometimes it is the sound of an old reality losing its ability to contain you. The old version of you could survive almost anywhere. You could adapt. You could overextend yourself. You could silence your instincts. You could carry responsibilities that never belonged to you. You could remain in spaces that depleted you because you believed leaving would cost too much. But the version of you emerging now is no longer willing to pay for belonging with self-abandonment. That is why the comeback feels messy. You are not simply receiving a better life. You are being reshaped so you do not recreate the old pain inside the new blessing. You are learning how to receive without fear, how to rest without guilt, how to be supported without expecting a hidden condition, how to experience stability without constantly preparing for it to disappear. The miracle is not only what is coming toward you. The miracle is that when it arrives, you will no longer be the person who believes you must suffer in order to keep it. The pressure was expanding. Your capacity. You have been carrying a kind of pressure that felt disproportionate to the life you were trying to live. It seemed as though every simple task required extra strength. Every delay felt heavier. Every setback touched something deeper. Even when you tried to remain hopeful, there were moments when the pressure became so intense that you wondered whether you were being crushed beneath the weight of your own life. But pressure does not always appear because something is ending. Sometimes it appears because something within you is expanding faster than your current reality can accommodate. Your spirit had outgrown the space. Your vision had outgrown the circumstances. Your truth had outgrown the version of you who kept shrinking to survive. That pressure was the tension between where you were and what your soul already knew was possible. You were being strengthened in places that once collapsed under stress. Your intuition was becoming clearer. Your boundaries were becoming stronger. Your ability to recognize manipulation, false promises, conditional support, and misalignment was becoming sharper. You were being prepared to hold more without losing yourself inside it, because the next chapter cannot be sustained by the same habits that carried you through survival. You cannot take chronic fear into a life that requires trust. You cannot take constant self-abandonment into a life built around freedom. You cannot take the belief that everything will disappear into a chapter where you are being asked to receive, build, and remain. So the pressure began exposing every belief that could not travel with you. The belief that you must accept whatever arrives because nothing better will come. The belief that you must prove your worth through exhaustion. The belief that peace is temporary. The belief that being chosen matters more than being respected. The belief that your life became permanently assigned to its hardest chapter. Those beliefs are losing their power because your future requires more room than fear was willing to give you. Some of what you lost was connected to the reality you were leaving. It belonged to the version of your life where you had to overperform to be valued, where you had to tolerate disrespect to maintain connection, where you had to ignore your own needs to keep everything from falling apart. And although you may have loved parts of that life, it could not continue in the same form. Not because you were unworthy of keeping it, but because what was built around your survival could not become the foundation of your freedom. This is why divine restoration can look so different from what you expected. You thought you were waiting for the old door to reopen. Meanwhile, life was preparing an entirely different entrance. You thought you needed the same people to finally recognize your value. Meanwhile, you were being moved toward places where your value would not have to be argued. You thought restoration meant proving that the people who rejected you were wrong. But the higher form may be entering a life where their opinion no longer has the power to determine anything. The reversal is not simply that you receive what they said you could not have. The reversal is that you become someone whose future can no longer be controlled by what they tried to take. They may have interrupted a chapter. They did not cancel the story. They may have caused damage. They did not inherit authority over everything that follows. They may have believed the collapse would permanently reduce you, but the collapse cleared space for a version of you they never prepared themselves to witness. The return will be too precise to dismiss. What is coming will not feel random. It will connect to prayers you stopped speaking about. It will answer questions you thought life had forgotten. It will touch the exact places where you experienced the deepest absence. Not because every painful event was secretly necessary, but because the pain will not be permitted to have the final word. The return will carry details that feel personal, the right opportunity appearing after repeated rejection. The right support arriving after you became accustomed to carrying everything alone. The right environment opening after you spent too long in places that made you feel unsafe, unseen, or unwanted. The timing will feel almost impossible to explain. You will look back and realize that while you were grieving what had fallen apart, something else was quietly moving into position. Connections were being made, doors were being prepared, ideas were developing. Your capacity was expanding. Your clarity was sharpening. Your new reality was forming before you had enough evidence to believe in it. And when the pieces finally begin coming together, it will not feel like you simply returned to where you started. It will feel like life carried you beyond what you originally believed was possible. That is the higher form. Not merely getting back what disappeared, but receiving something that matches your growth, something that honors your boundaries, something that feels like peace instead of another test of endurance, something that allows you to understand that your story was never permanently defined by what collapsed. Your comeback is not going to look like you crawling back toward the life that rejected you. It is going to look like you rising into a reality that finally recognizes who you have become. The pressure was not the conclusion. The loss was not the conclusion. The silence was not the conclusion. You are approaching the part where life begins answering devastation with restoration, where the things that felt unfair begin turning unfair in reverse, where what returns carries more than what was taken. And if this message is helping you believe in the restoration that may already be unfolding behind the scenes, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who needs to remember that what was lost does not have to be the end of their story, because what returns will carry more than what was taken. More peace, more protection, more truth, more alignment, and when it arrives, you will understand that life was never preparing you to repeat the past. It was preparing you to receive a future the old version of your reality could never have held.